So in this section, we're going to explore the first steps in conducting a developmental assessment of young children in early intervention, how we might proceed before meeting the child in the clinic session, and how we might set that up. One of the first steps in both our thinking but also determining the activities that we're going to do is trying to generate in our mind, who is this child? So obviously we want to know their name, their age, where they live, their siblings, what kind of school, preschool are they attending, is it a special one or a mainstream, and the parents' names. One of the most useful things to be able to do prior to meeting children and when you're going to interact with them is try and memorize a few very specific details. Child's name, their age, mum and dad's name. This is particularly helpful to having generated in your mind where they live. But as we're gathering all of this information, right from the referral report, the referral information, or anything we're gathering before meeting this child, is attempting to identify from this information how will it impact on the assessment we're going to conduct. So for example, what level of language does this child use? Do they communicate predominantly with single words, or is it 2 to 3 word phrases? Or do they use full sentences? Do they use full sentences and are very chatty? These simple statements prime us to work out how to conduct the assessment session. They give us valuable information. Knowing that you have a child with very little language is not only going to impact dramatically upon the type of standardized assessment you're going to do, it should also determine the way you're going to interact, the statements you're going to make, the questions you're going to ask. Knowing that a child has very limited attention, finding out that the child doesn't tend to stay with any one activity for more than a few minutes should also have significant impact on the way you're thinking of structuring a session with a child, or even conducting activities, or what kind of activities you might do. It certainly should speak to whether you should be conducting a standardized test of cognitive ability or even developmental testing. Finding out that a child is extremely active, or that they are, in the words of many people, non-compliant, could speak quite loudly to the validity and usefulness of doing standardized testing as your primary or first activity, or whether you're going to get very useful information if you were to conduct it at all. Coming back to some of this language, you will hear many words around children. Poor eye contact, they have poor attention, limited attention, they're highly active, they're non-compliant, they're defiant. I find these terms not so useful and not so helpful, and in fact can steer you away from a better understanding of a child. First of all, let's take a term like non-compliant. Let's put aside for the moment the authoritarian power relationship suggesting to that people must comply with me or with a parent. If we were to translate that into cooperation, the child struggles to cooperate or does not cooperate with requests or instructions to do tasks, or does not cooperate with instructions to get dressed. Not only is it more specific, it speaks more to an appreciation of the factors that may be explaining their behavior. Non-compliance suggests not following authority. Not cooperating with requests to get dressed speaks to the task. So what we want to do is get more detailed information. So the more neutral our language, the more descriptive, the more detailed that we make it, the more that it encourages and fosters within us information that will make more sense as to the why. Similarly, defiance. What is defiance? What does the child do, and in what context? Now, before we get lost in 1,000 questions, that is an interview in itself, what I'm in fact suggesting here is that in our minds, we're not using this terminology, and through simple questions asked quite quickly and early on can in fact guide us better into how we're going to spend time with a child and how we're going to think about them. So let's translate these statements into much more behavioral descriptions. So rather than talking about defiance, let's look at the kind of request a child doesn't cooperate with, or the fact that they say no when asked to do tasks that they haven't chosen, which is different from the fact that they will engage and participate in play activities with materials that they like. Similarly with poor attention, focusing on the kind of tasks that a child will do for how long, and the kind of tasks they seem to struggle with. So for example, talking to a parent very briefly, you can find out that a child will play with their preferred toys for long periods of time. However, will only look at a book for a few minutes. This could speak more to difficulties around understanding the value of books than to attention as a broad concept. In other words, it's not that they have an overarching attention difficulty. They in fact have either a motivational difficulty with things like books, whereas they enjoy materials and play materials where they can put things together. Or it could speak to some difficulty in understanding the value of stories, which is more of a social difficulty. So the more that we are able to describe what the child actually does, it gives us a better appreciation of what it means and what it means for the way that we may construct a direct assessment in a clinic session. So let's go back. Let's step back a little bit in working out how we prepare to meet this child by generating some understanding of who they are before we meet them in a clinic session. One of the best places to start is to review all the previous reports, referral forms, and questionnaires completed that will be in the file. Read them, but don't just read them. Sequence them in order. Note either on the reports themselves, if you're able to, or make copies of them so you can do this, or simply type this out on a blank piece of paper. When the assessment was completed, how old the child was, and what were the key points being made within it. What are the key pieces of information being described about that child? What were the main conclusions, and what were the main recommendations? Don't have to rewrite the whole report, but just distill from it the key things that you are now learning about this child. This can serve a number of purposes. First of all, it truly gears you up for the child that you're coming in. Your mind is much better prepared. You already have some information that you may not need to then regather yourself. It also can establish rapport very quickly with a parent because you've demonstrated that you have a good appreciation of who their child is. And it allows you into a discussion with them around the journey that they have been through with their child. It allows you to step into their experience of the assessments they've had and get their understanding of it. I would also generate a list of questions and queries coming out of each report. Always one of the main questions that I have for any parent is, what did you think of this assessment? How did you find this report? What do you think of it? Getting their perspective on, did they agree? Did it summarize them well? Were there bits missing? But other questions and queries are the gaps that may have been identified when you read the report, or things that you would like to probe in further detail. So for example, if there's in a report it's stated that this child has poor eye contact, I'd certainly want to probe what they meant by that. But much information about the child that is about to enter into your clinic room where you're going to do some tasks with, that snapshot of who they are can emerge from reading this material. For example, knowing that a child was able to engage in a language assessment and is in the average range is certainly suggestive that this child is going to be able to converse with you when they come in. Similarly, if in that speech and language theory report there is reference made to them having a severe expressive language impairment, it is quite likely, with no other words, that you're about to meet a child that may struggle to convey anything more than single words or 2 to 3 or 2 to 4 word phrases, which again should really frame the way that you're going to conduct your assessment. If I already have information about the child's early language milestones or early motor milestones in previous reports, I don't need to put this into a new interview with the parent. Once I have gone through the fact that I have read the report and said, was this correct? Was the information in here accurate? And they assent to the fact that it was. Then I can take with good faith that that information is relevant. So again, prior to the session, before I'm meeting a child, once I've read reports, one of the things I might consider doing really quite early is sending out some materials to a parent. Now normally I'm going to do this after having spoken to them, but on some occasions this can be done by letter. And the purpose of sending out the questionnaires before you're meeting the child, before you're really talking to a parent or conducting the interview with them, is that you can have scores. You can have scores of where this child's ability is at. That means that you've got the score bit out of the way. It can frame your thinking. So for example, knowing that a child is scoring very low in the adaptive behavior questionnaires, for example, you're knowing that this child is struggling significantly in all of these areas. It also will have ratings on particular questions that when I read through will help me develop a better profile, a better understanding of the strengths and weaknesses for this child, and the things that I may want to probe in further detail in interview, but won't have to repeat all of the information that's already been gathered through the questionnaire. Also think, particularly if you attach a letter explaining it, or you've already spoken to a parent, it can serve the very valuable function of priming them for the kind of information you're looking for, particularly when you explain to a parent that you want them to write any notes or details that come to mind. Feel free to write all over the questionnaire. It also gives the parent an opportunity to practice and rehearse on what they want to focus. Many parents want to give the information. They just find it difficult under the pressure of being asked specifically with an interview question to recall it all at that moment. And as the interview goes on, they become more tired. It becomes harder. This gives them an opportunity to sit down and think, what is it they want to say? And giving permission to parents and saying, write down any concerns you have, any thoughts, any questions, or what you think we want to focus on in it, is a good way to start the conversation, because giving them a chance to think about what it is they want to say. It gives me a chance to be primed, so I know how to focus my questions better. The time between a clinician and a parent, or between the clinician and a child, is precious. It's limited. We want to get the most that we can. It isn't about efficiency to get this assessment out of the way quickly. It's to utilize the small amount of time we're going to have to its maximum potential. So one of the ways to do that is to get a lot of the information done where the parent can do it by themselves, so that when we're spending that time together, we can be focusing in on the bits that we need to talk in greater detail, and that I don't need to spend time asking question after question after question just to get a specific answer when it can be gathered through questionnaire. Now, of course, there are times where this is not possible for a variety of reasons. One can be where it is difficult for some parents to read or make sense of it. Two, there are some parents who are in significant time pressure themselves. And three, some parents can simply misunderstand the function or the intent of the questions, so the information you're getting back isn't always as useful as you'd hoped. But still think it's an incredibly good starting point to consider. A critical step early on in the process is to make direct contact with a parent, typically by phone call, before you're going to conduct an interview, before you're going to send out a questionnaire, before you're going to meet their child in a clinic session or come out to their home. One of the things to do is to make a phone call that you're going to set a little bit of time aside for. In other words, not try and fit it in 5 minutes before you've got another session. So that if it is going to continue for a little bit of time, you've given that scope, but made it quite clearly that when you ring them, you're ringing to say hello, to set up the assessment process. One of the things I recommend very strongly is that the sooner you do this from when you first become involved, the better. So even if you're not thinking of meeting their child for a month, to ring them and to let them know that you're intending to do this, the assessment has begun, introducing your name, explaining who you are and how you're going about it, and very importantly, giving a sense of who you are. Assessments are about relationship. Assessments are about relationship between you and parents, and about relationship between you and the child. The degree to which you allay their concerns, that you are a real person that is interested in their child and is looking to collaborate with them, the more this assessment process is going to be valid and useful. This is the time to check out their understanding and goals of the assessment. Now, in relation to counselling, would have been taught that there are 2 or 3 different ways that you can always start when you first meet a client. One can be the very open way, the very open question of, tell me why you're here. Another way can be that you clarify very quickly, my understanding is that the reason you're here is that you've been referred from a speech and language therapist who's concerned your child has autism. Whichever way you select, what you're attempting to do is to clarify their understanding of why we're conducting this assessment and what they're looking from it. Now, when you make this first phone call, the first thing we always want to do is check that they have time to talk. Have I got you at an okay time, or will I ring you back later? Make sure that they're prepared. Also be aware that some parents are going to find this phone call coming out of the blue. So therefore, you may want to give them a second or two to process what's happening. And that sometimes it may be that you're actually putting it out there that, well, I'm just ringing you to find a good time to sit down and talk about the assessment we're going to conduct. When would be good to talk with you? So even to put it into the more proactive rather than asking, is this an okay time? I have on occasions had parents break down and cry when I first give them the phone call. Sometimes just relief that the assessment is now occurring. But for some parents, it's just an emotional experience that they now see that this assessment is real. That me simply saying hello and introducing myself brings up those feelings. This is okay. This is normal. This is part of the process. Assessment also involves the parent's experience of this process. This is nothing for us to be scared of or worried about. We simply acknowledge it and then look for a simple solution. Will I ring you back in a few minutes? We talk again tomorrow. And then check in with them when we ring them again. Similarly, I'd be very tempted to give phone calls just leading up to the day in which the child is coming into the clinic for assessment, whether it be standardized developmental assessment, cognitive assessment, or in fact we're doing an ADOS or free play observation. You do want to check out how the child is doing. If the child is ill or tired or has been very upset recently, this is either not going to be the best time to do standardized testing, or it may require some good adaptation to get the best out of the child, particularly with children with autism, or children where there's going to be difficulties with engagement, or the suggestion that there may be difficulties with engagement. Knowing that the child is not well should speak to what we're going to do. Many parents don't want to necessarily say this because they're worried that they will lose the assessment or have to wait a very long time. But most of us clinicians do have some flexibility. If you don't know much about this child's language, either in that first phone call or in the phone call you're making just prior to the session occurring, one little task that you can do is get a language sample from the parent. By language sample, we mean getting the parents to say or describe exactly the sentences the child has used. So you can just do this on the phone. You can just say, look, just in the last day or so, just tell me some of the things your child has told you. What kind of language has he been using? And if a parent just says, oh, he was telling me about what he was doing with his Lego, then I would ask, exactly what were the words he said? Narrate back to me. Oh, they'd be hard to remember. That's okay, just give me the best. And then you get a sense of the kind of language, whether again be 2-3 word sentences or full sentences, and are many sentences being pulled together to convey a series of ideas. If the parent finds this difficult, one of the things you might say is, would you mind just keeping a record over the next day? Take an hour here or an hour there and just write down exactly the words that they use. I don't need to hear everything. I just need a bit of a sample to get a sense of the kind of sentences they use. And would you email that to me? Here's my email. Or will you just write it out and bring it along with you? Either way, it's allowing me to conduct the assessment by gathering information ahead of time that not only will guide how I do the assessment, but is in fact the information we need as part of the assessment. One of the key things that I want before I'm going to meet a child is to know, what does this child like doing? What activities do they enjoy? Yes, these could be potential motivators. They could be used in a rewarding way. They could be used to be structured assessments, but they also, just as importantly, if not more importantly, can be ways of knowing how to engage with a child who may struggle in a clinic session. Knowing that a child likes Thomas the Tank Engine means that if I'm using Thomas the Tank Engine books, we have activities I know he's going to enjoy. It's a way of establishing rapport. It's a way of doing something where I can examine, explore their other abilities, like turn taking, eye contact, commentary. And I'm going to discuss with the parent the child's attention. What do they like to do, but also how well do they attend? Of course, they're going to say that most parents are going to say that their children attend very well when they're watching something on the TV or the iPad. I mean, when a book is being read or playing Lego with a parent, and just getting a little bit of a sample of the kind of activities and how well they attend to the different types or different forms of activity. For example, reading versus free play versus doing tasks. And one of the things I always want to do is clarify with a parent, and if I've ended up talking to them twice, on both occasions, what will and will not be happening during our session, and describing this in concrete narration of chronology. That is, when you guys turn up, you'll be coming into a waiting room. There may be other people in there. I will then come out. We will be walking straight in. And when you're talking to them, one of the things that will be happening is I won't be talking very much with you. I'll be focusing very much on Kian, who's coming in for the assessment, and explaining. I give good description of the experience they're about to have. Give a sense of how long it's going to go for and the conditions of which we may change that. So if Kian is appearing particularly tired or upset, we're just going to end the session. That won't be a problem. I'll give you a phone call later and we'll look at how we gather the information in a different way. I think this is very important. I think it's important that we describe to people what's about to happen. Think about it this another way. Think about those times you've had to go somewhere unfamiliar, like a medical examination, medical procedure, going into hospital. One of the most anxiety-provoking aspects of it is you don't know what to expect. You don't know how long it's going to take, you don't know how long you're going to be waiting, and you don't know the procedure. These things are so simply overcome. And what you want is parents who are calm and relaxed as possible, who are then going to induce or encourage relaxation in their child. You want this to be a collaborative experience with parents, not something being subjected on them. Fundamentally, what this all results in or focuses in on is that when we are doing assessments of children who potentially have very significant difficulties with the language, communication, attention, being able to do tasks, cognitive, along with their social behavior and their activities of daily living skill and coordination. We have children who have significant difficulties, particularly with attention and motivation. We want to have as much information as quickly as possible about their abilities so that we can actually set up the assessment to be the most effective and successful as possible. So who is the child and their abilities? We want this so that we can prepare the session and set it up and accommodate it in a way that's going to work. We also need to understand that our assessment is going to begin from the moment they enter into our building. Putting this another way, the importance of preparation for this session is critical, and the more likely that there is to be a learning disability or autism, the more significant this is. It applies equally to children who have high levels of anxiety or can have behavioral challenges. Whereas it is quite possible to walk into any national school and meet a child for the first time in the resource teaching area or in the assessment area, pull out a standardized cognitive test, administer it with very little information about this child, score it up, and be able to give meaningful results and conclusions. Many of the children you're going to meet in early intervention services have so many vulnerabilities that to do this simply promotes the likelihood that you will not get valid assessment results. You won't get good scores, and from it you won't get good useful information. So the more prepared we are, the more able to adapt what we're going to do, the more useful this assessment process will be. We've talked already about verifying the purpose of the assessment, establishing, collaborating and confirming this with parents ahead of time, making sure that they understand that their understanding of the reason we're doing the assessment is the same as yours, or yours is the same as theirs. Making sure that we've oriented parents to the process, both prior to the day, but also reiterating it when they come in. That we've already gathered information about their attention, motivation, language, potential of meltdowns ahead of time and have a bit of a plan how we might manage it. That we may have even chatted with parents around this, that identified the sort of things that will and won't work. We then also need to make sure that the testing or the assessing we're going to do in that clinic is well matched to who the child truly is. In other words, we are selecting tests that have got the most likelihood of working. So doing standardized cognitive testing for children with extreme attention and motivational difficulties may be the least fruitful way of gathering information. It may be that we're better off starting off with other activities, and if they're able with that, then to add on or move into or transition into the more standardized testing. We may in fact get more information from a non-standardized testing approach. But regardless of this, if we have identified that we are going to do a standardized developmental test, for example, the Bailey or the Griffiths, or if we've identified that we are going to do standardized cognitive testing, for example, the WIPSI or the Stanford Binet, what is important is that we have backups in case this unfolds badly. Have play materials, have easier types of tests that may not give you the standardized IQ score, but certainly allow you to do something with this child. For example, the curricular-based ones, or using developmental tests where you can't do cognitive tests, so that you at least are able to do something. Have activity books that you can do that allow you to at least engage with a child. Another key idea is make sure you have sufficient time for your session if a child is very slow to warm up. There are a number of children who will come in and simply won't sit at the table, or when they come in will have a major meltdown, or will hide under their parents' legs, and can take considerable time before they're prepared to sit down and engage. Or, if they do engage, can then become diverted and distracted and leave, and it can be quite difficult to get them back. And this can take considerable time. So these children may simply need to have more time allocated for the completion of the task. I also think that it's important to recognize that one session assessments are fraught and problematic for many children, and that having the potential in your diary that you may do a second or even a third session is well worth it. It's not that you have them there for every child, it's that you're able to put them in if you require them. There are, however, some children where I think it's very useful to proactively plan that you're going to do much shorter sessions, but do more of them. We'll talk in another section about the idea that you can do 20 to 30 minute sessions and have the child come in 2 or 3 times. as opposed to doing a full 1 to 1.5 hour session, and that there's no real extra time on your part. And many parents are really quite comfortable with doing that because they know they're going to get a better assessment. The other part of preparation, which is critical, is prepare the physical environment for the child coming in. In other words, before the child has entered into the clinic, before they come into the waiting area, have all your materials prepared. A practice that I've had for a number of years is that if I know that I've got a child coming in for 9:30, I'll in fact have the room set up, if it's possible, at least an hour beforehand, then go do something else. The reason is that if people turn up early and having them wait around is not particularly conducive to a child doing well, or if I get distracted, that I'm not under pressure. And one of the great enemies to good assessment is setting up under pressure. Once the room is established, everything is in place, then you can relax, and whenever they arrive is whenever they arrive, and then you can step into doing the assessment seamlessly and without effort. Make sure that I actually have all the testing equipment. It's a simple fact that when you're sharing testing equipment, things are not set up properly, items are missing, or they've been relocated to somewhere else. Knowing this an hour or 2 hours ahead of time allows you that if you have to, you can adapt. Finding out 5 minutes beforehand is not particularly useful. Similarly, I want to make sure that the physical environment of the room is well matched to the child. That is, I've made sure that the room speaks well to a child to encourage them to engage with me in the tasks I want them to do. I'll talk about this in the next section in more detail. Physical preparation is having all of my forms ready, having everything in a format that I know that when they turn up, I can immediately stop what I'm doing and step into not only the assessment room, but an assessment mindset where I have mindfully stopped and rested my attention on the fact I am now thinking only about this child and only about these parents. It's a physical ritual act of I'm picking up my folder that has the pre-completed names and age of the forms on it, that has the previous notes that I've taken, that has the forms I'm going to use, and my notes already with a pen placed within it. So the one act of picking it up and walking with it is now the cue to me. I am now focusing only on this assessment, this child, and these parents. In the next section, we're going to then go into much greater detail on the actual conducting of the assessment. But in doing good assessments, the more you are prepared, the more you're set up for the moment that they come in, the better. Now, there are many circumstances of where you don't get a great chance to set up the room physically before you're going to do it, simply because it's being booked by somebody else. Some of the more practical ways that I approach this in time is that I always try to book assessments to be the first one in, so that I am able to do that. Or if I am going to do assessment, try and have a room to book for a whole morning or a whole day and do 2 or 3 children. That way I'm able to control that room. In other words, wherever possible, ensure that your scheduling allows you to have the maximum control of the environment you're going to use, particularly when you have to share it with other clinicians. This may come across as somewhat controlling and OCD, but in reality, it is simply a way to ensure that the work you're going to do is going to be at its optimal. Because the key for me for good assessments is that you are not locating your attention and your resources on setting up or the administration, but instead on engaging a child and a parent. So the more these things are all set up and in place, the less of your energy and the less of your effort, which then can produce stress, is on the getting everything in place.